There's a paradox at the center of the human experience. The self is both the source of our greatest potential and the root of our greatest problems. We long to grow beyond ourselves, yet we are constantly being pulled back into the orbit of our own fears, desires, and demands. And somewhere between selfishness and selflessness lies the deeper question of what the self even is and what it's meant to become. Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. In this episode, we're exploring the spiritual dynamics of self, why selfishness keeps us small, why selflessness isn't the erasure of the self, but its expansion, and how our evolution, individually and collectively, depends on where we place the self within the larger order of things. Let's begin with a simple but surprisingly difficult question. What is the self? At first glance, it seems obvious. The self is me, my thoughts, my personality, my preferences, my identity, my story. The moment we go deeper, the concept dissolves into abstraction. Am I my body, my mind, my consciousness, my soul? Am I the product of my experiences or the author of them? Am I an individual or an expression of something larger? For most of human history, cultures treated the self not as an isolated unit, but as a relational identity, a node in a network of families, tribes, communities, and cosmic orders. Yourself was inseparable from your responsibilities, your relationships, your spiritual grounding. But in our modern age, the self has been inflated, idolized, and distorted into something it was never meant to bear, a god unto itself. We live in an era of what psychologists call expressive individualism, the belief that the highest purpose of life is to discover and express your unique identity, feelings, and desires. Be yourself becomes the highest moral command. Follow your heart becomes the guiding principle. Speak your truth replaces seek the truth. This philosophy promises freedom, but delivers fragmentation. It promises empowerment, but often produces loneliness. It promises authenticity, but can devolve into narcissism. The problem isn't that individuality is bad. The problem is that individuality without transcendence collapses into ego. The self becomes the center of the universe. And when the self becomes the center of the universe, everything else becomes peripheral, optional, or disposable. Community becomes an accessory. Commitment becomes conditional. Truth becomes subjective. Responsibility becomes negotiable. We have endless talk about self-care, but very little about self-discipline. Endless talk about self-love, but very little about self-sacrifice. Endless talk about self-expression, but very little about self-transcendence. We've built a culture where the self is everything, and yet almost no one knows who they are. This spiritual emptiness is not an accident. It's the predictable consequence of elevating the ego to the throne. When the self becomes God, the self becomes a tyrant. Before we talk about spiritual evolution or the omega point, which have been themes in recent episodes, we need to clarify the difference between selfish and selfless, because our culture tends to misunderstand these terms. People think selfish equals bad, selfless equals good. But the distinction is not about moral worth. It's about orientation. A selfish person is someone who places their own desires, needs, and preferences at the center of reality. The world becomes a stage on which others exist primarily to serve or validate them. Relationships become transactions. Morality becomes negotiable. People become tools. Selfishness is essentially a shrinking of perspective, a collapse of the horizon until the self is the only thing that matters. A selfless person places others at the center, sometimes to the point of neglecting themselves. Ironically, even this can become unhealthy. Some people lose their identity in caregiving, religious zeal, or martyrdom. They erase themselves, believing it to be virtuous. They become hollow vessels defined entirely by others' needs. Selflessness, in its pure form, is noble. But self-erasure is not holiness. It's spiritual dissociation. The highest form of spiritual maturity is not selfishness or selflessness. It is what we might call thirdness, a life oriented around something greater than either the individual or the collective. This is where Gale Sayers' creed becomes revolutionary. My Lord is first, my family is second, and I am third. This creates a harmonious structure. God, the sacred, the highest good, first. Other people, second. Myself, third. The self is not eliminated. The self is not worshipped. The self is ordered. This is the core of spiritual health. A rightly ordered self within a larger moral and spiritual ecology. Every spiritual tradition in human history teaches some version of this idea, that the self must be rooted in something larger, something sacred, something transcendent. If your identity is grounded in your ego, you will be fragile. If your identity is grounded in your desires, you will be unstable. If your identity is grounded in the opinions of others, you will be enslaved. But if your identity is grounded in the sacred, you become anchored. This is the paradox at the heart of spirituality. You must decentralize the self in order to become your truest self. This is where Teilhard de Chardin's concept of the omega point becomes deeply relevant. Teilhard believed that humanity is evolving, not just biologically, but spiritually, toward a point of ultimate union, integration, and consciousness. A point where all selves converge without losing their individuality, like instruments in a symphony. But the only way to reach the omega point is through self-transcendence, the ability to orient our lives toward the highest good, rather than toward the ego. This requires discipline. It requires humility. It requires sacrifice. It requires a recognition that the self is not the center of the universe. Instead, the self is a participant in something larger. One of the greatest spiritual misunderstandings of the modern age is the belief that the self is a closed, isolated system, that I exist over here and you exist over there. The space between us is empty. But that is not how reality works. The illusion of separation is the root of selfishness. The recognition of interconnectedness is the root of spiritual maturity. Selfishness is built on a false premise, that I can thrive while others suffer. But we now know, psychologically, sociologically, spiritually, that the self shrivels when disconnected from others. You can have money, power, pleasure, status, followers, influence, and achievements, and still feel spiritually starved. Ego is a bottomless pit. It can want, but it cannot be filled. It can take, but it cannot receive. It can control, but it cannot connect. The ego is not evil. It is necessary. But it is not meant to be in charge. The ego is a tool. The problem is when it becomes the architect. When the ego becomes the identity, self-interest becomes self-idolatry. And once idolatry begins, destruction follows, internally and socially. This brings us to one of the most powerful illustrations in moral philosophy, the tragedy of the commons. Imagine a small village where everyone grazes their animals on a shared pasture, the commons. The pasture can sustainably support a certain number of animals. If everyone grazes responsibly, the entire community thrives. But if even one person decides to be selfish and graze extra animals, they gain more wealth. Seeing this, others do the same. Eventually, the pasture collapses. What began as one person's self-centeredness becomes the ruin of all. This is not just a parable. It is a pattern, one repeated across history, economics, environment, politics, relationships, and spirituality. The tragedy of the commons reveals 5 deeply spiritual truths. 1, that selfish actions rarely stay isolated. When one person chooses self-centeredness, it pressures others to follow. Vice is contagious. 2, the community pays the price of the individual's ego. The pasture collapses for everyone, even those who acted responsibly. 3, short-term gains produce long-term destruction. Self-centeredness is always short-sighted. 4, the solution is not the elimination of the self, but the elevation of the common good. You can still graze your animals, but you do it within a shared moral framework. The tragedy of the commons is not ultimately an economic problem. It is a spiritual problem. It is rooted in disordered love, disordered desire, disordered identity, and disordered purpose. This is why being selfless, in the simplistic sense, is not enough. If one villager grazes nothing while others graze too much, the result is still collapse. What we need is ordered selves, rightly oriented towards something higher. Gale Sayers understood this. Put God first, put others second, put yourself third, not zero. Zero leads to collapse just as much as ego does. Humanity's understanding of self has evolved over millennia. Early humans viewed the self primarily through the lens of survival. Avoid danger, secure food, protect the tribe, maintain social ties. The self was functional, a tool for staying alive. But as societies grew more complex, the self became more psychological. We developed self-reflection, self-narrative, self-esteem, self-improvement. And eventually we arrived at our modern conception, the expressive, sovereign, autonomous self. This evolution was necessary, but it was not meant to be the endpoint. The next stage of human evolution is spiritual. The evolution from self-centeredness to meaning-centeredness, from ego identity to transcendent identity, from autonomy to connectedness, from isolation to integration. This is the journey toward what Teilhard de Chardin called the omega point, the ultimate convergence of humanity toward unity, consciousness, and love. But the omega point is not inevitable. Evolution is not guaranteed. It requires the surrender of the ego's throne. Spiritual evolution demands humility, purpose, service, self-awareness, accountability, and transcendence. This is why selfishness is spiritually regressive. It pulls the self backward, away from unity and towards fragmentation. Selflessness alone isn't enough either, if it's self-erasure. Spiritual maturity requires a self strong enough to serve, humble enough to listen, and rooted enough to grow. My God is first, my family and friends are second, and I am third isn't a slogan. It describes an entire spiritual architecture, a way of orienting the self within a larger moral and relational universe. It is the very definition of the spiritual dimension of the SPIES model. It says, I am not nothing, but I am not everything. I matter, but I am not the center. My life has value, but my life is not the axis on which the world turns. The order matters. When you invert it, when you become first, your life collapses into ego. When you eliminate yourself, putting yourself last or treating yourself as disposable, you collapse into resentment, burnout, or loss of identity. I am third refuses both distortions. It affirms the sacredness of the self without inflating it. It affirms the primacy of God or the transcendent without turning faith into fanaticism. This framework creates harmony. My God is first. My life is grounded in something beyond the ego. I am oriented toward the highest good, not my own impulses. My family and friends are second. My relationships, responsibilities, and service to others shape my identity and my purpose. I am third. I nurture myself. I grow. I rest. I learn. I take care of my body and soul, but always in alignment with a larger purpose. This is not a rejection of self. It is the ordering of self. The proper order is the foundation of spiritual maturity. One of the deepest misunderstandings of the modern age is the assumption that the self is sovereign, that we are sole authors and authorities of our lives. We hear it constantly. You do you. Follow your heart. Live your truth. You are the main character. No one can tell you who to be. On the surface, this sounds empowering, but spiritually, it can be suffocating. If the self is sovereign, then every mistake is entirely your fault. Every need must be met by you alone. Every purpose must be invented from scratch. Every struggle is faced in isolation. Every burden must be carried by your own strength. The sovereign self is not free. It is buried under unbearable weight. But when the self is a steward, everything changes. A steward is responsible, but not alone. A steward acts, but not as a god. A steward cultivates, but does not control. A steward serves, but does not self-destruct. A steward builds, but knows the foundation is not their own creation. Stewardship reframes the self in three crucial ways. Responsibility without tyranny. You're responsible for your actions, your character, your relationships, your growth. But you are not responsible for the entire universe. You participate in something larger. Purpose without pressure. You don't have to invent your identity from scratch. Meaning is not manufactured by the ego. It is discovered, received, cultivated, and lived. Identity without isolation. You cannot know who you are by looking only inward. You know yourself in relationship to God, to others, to community, to creation. Stewardship restores the self to its rightful place. Sovereignty traps the self in a cage of its own making. In ancient cultures, idols were made of wood, stone, or metal. Today, our idols are psychological, and the most worshipped idol of all is the self. Not the true self, not the soul, not the spirit, not the divine image, but the ego self, the bundle of preferences, insecurities, appetites, and impulses that we mistake for identity. When the ego becomes sacred, three things happen. Feelings become moral absolutes. If I feel offended, then the other person must be wrong. If I feel uncomfortable, then something must be unjust. If I feel desire, then I must be entitled to it. This is not morality. This is emotional absolutism. Desire becomes destiny. I want it, therefore it is good. I don't want it, therefore it is bad. But spiritual traditions unanimously teach that desire is a terrible compass. Desire can be corrupted, chaotic, or immature. Desire is not identity, it is data. The self becomes untouchable. Criticism is an attack. Accountability is oppression. Limits are abuses. Boundaries are betrayals. Expectation is toxic. Discipline is punishment. In this state, the self becomes both extremely fragile and extremely demanding, a tyrant and a victim at the same time. This is the psychological and spiritual profile of our age. We have raised a generation of people who are hypersensitive and hyper-entitled because the self has become sacred. But a sacred self cannot grow. It can only defend. This is why I am third is so powerful. It removes the ego from the altar. It decenters the self without destroying it. It frees us from the tyranny of our own impulses. Because when the ego is no longer sacred, the soul can finally breathe. Abraham Maslow later in his life realized that he had made a profound mistake. We remember Maslow for his hierarchy of needs, with self-actualization at the top. But in his later writings, he admitted that the pinnacle of human development is not self-actualization. It is self-transcendence. Self-actualization is about becoming your best self. Self-transcendence is about becoming part of something beyond the self. This distinction is crucial. Self-actualization can still be ego-driven. My goals, my talents, my achievements, my potential. But self-transcendence orients the self toward meaning, calling, purpose, love, service, truth, the sacred, the communal, the eternal. This is not poetic metaphor. It is spiritual physics. The ego contracts, the soul expands. The ego grasps, the soul receives. The ego competes, the soul connects. The ego fears, the soul trusts. Self-transcendence is the process through which the self becomes aligned with the sacred, the infinite, the eternal. It's how we evolve toward the omega point, the convergence of all selves in love. This is why selfishness is not merely a moral failing. It is a spiritual dead end. Self-centeredness keeps the self small. Self-transcendence makes self luminous. And it's here that we reach a difficult but necessary question. How do we actually move from one to the other? Not in theory, not in abstraction, not in the comfort of reading spiritual language on a page, but in the lived tension of every human life. How do we move from a posture where the world revolves around us to a posture where we take our place in the world? A place where we matter, yes, but where our mattering is not the center of gravity. But here's the thing we don't like to admit. The gravitational pull of selfishness is strong. not because we're bad, but because we're wired for survival. The ego, psychologically, evolutionarily, neurologically, is built to protect us, to secure resources, to scan for threats, to preserve identity. It is self-serving because it's meant to keep the organism alive. But surviving is not the same thing as living. And the survival-focused ego, if left unchecked, makes the self small. It collapses the world down to what we can control, what we can dominate, what we can possess. It turns relationships into transactions. It turns community into competition. Spiritual growth, the transformation of consciousness, is the widening of that loop. It is the gradual shift from the closed self to the connected self, from the ego to the soul, from survival to significance. It is awakening to the reality that we are not separate and that our flourishing is tied inescapably, beautifully, and sometimes painfully to the flourishing of others. This is where the question of selfishness and selflessness becomes spiritually complex, because the opposite of selfish is not self-annihilation. The opposite of selfish is right-sized self. The self knows its place, the self that honors its worth without inflating it, a self that recognizes its needs without demanding that others meet them, a self that is grounded enough to be generous, secure enough to be compassionate, and whole enough to lift its gaze from its own reflection. So the real spiritual invitation is not be selfless instead of selfish. The real invitation is become self-capable of transcendence. But transcendence is not escape, it is expansion. My God is first, my family and friends are second, and I am third suggests a reordering of the universe in a way that frees one from the tyranny of self-centeredness. This is the paradox. When the self steps out from the center, it actually becomes more free, more stable, more spacious, more luminous, because the self finally has room to grow beyond its own orbit. Let's go deeper. Consider the concept of the omega point. Humanity is not meant to devolve into isolated individuals competing for survival. We're meant to evolve toward interconnectedness, toward shared meaning, toward collective awakening. At the omega point, the self does not disappear. It integrates. It joins a larger fold of consciousness without losing its identity, the way a musician becomes part of the symphony without losing their instrument or their voice. This is what spiritual evolution looks like, not erasing the self, but maturing the self until it can harmonize with others. And this is where selfishness becomes a barrier to spiritual evolution, because selfishness insists that the self is both composer and the conductor. Selfishness wants the self to be the entire orchestra. Selfishness resists connection because connection means surrendering absolute control. It requires trust. It requires vulnerability. It requires acknowledging that our voice is one among many, that our life is not the whole story, but one chapter in a sacred, unfolding narrative. Now contrast that with selflessness. True selflessness is not weakness. It is not martyrdom. It is not burnout. True selflessness is the natural expression of self that understands its place in the cosmic order. It is humility in the truest sense of the word, groundedness. Not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself correctly, seeing yourself clearly, recognizing that you belong to something larger. The tragedy of the commons is what happens when the self refuses to grow up, when the ego makes its desires the center of reality, when the individual says, my needs are more important than the community needs, forgetting that the self cannot flourish in a depleted ecosystem. A selfish self destroys its own habitat. A selfless self cultivates the conditions for shared flourishing. And that's not just true on pastures. It's true in marriages, friendships, workplaces, churches, neighborhoods, nations, and even inside the inner landscape of our own psyche. Because each of us contains multiple selves competing for attention, for safety, for control. The tragedy of the inner commons happens when the loudest, most fear-driven parts of us drown out the wiser, more generous parts. When we overgraze our own emotional resources. When we prioritize short-term gratification over long-term fulfillment. Spiritual maturity is learning to govern the inner commons wisely, to recognize the self is not one voice, but a chorus. And when the wrong voice leads, fear, pride, insecurity, the hunger for validation, the self collapses into selfishness. But when the higher self leads, love, compassion, courage, openness, the inner ecosystem thrives. So how does all this tie together? To understand selfishness and selflessness, we have to understand that the self is a dynamic, evolving, relational being. The self is not a static entity. It is a process. It is something unfolding across time, shaped by choices, relationships, experiences, wounds, beliefs, and aspirations. The self is what emerges when consciousness encounters the world and decides how to respond. In the direction of that response, whether it bends inward or outward, determines the spiritual trajectory of our lives. A self that collapses inward becomes anxious, controlling, defensive, and fearful. A self that opens outward becomes grounded, generous, connected, and courageous. Spirituality at its core is the practice of orienting the self towards something larger. And that orientation, whether toward God, truth, love, community, or compassion, reshapes the internal landscape. It reorients the gravitational center. It transforms selfish impulses into selfless expressions, not through suppression, but through expansion. This is why the mantra, I am third, is so powerful. It breaks the gravitational orbit of the ego. It repositions the self in a constellation of meaning where God is first, others are second, and I am third. Not because I'm worthless, but because I am part of something worth more than my isolated experience. And here's the irony. When I put myself third, I don't shrink, I grow. I become more spacious inside, more capable of love, more available to grace, more open to transformation. Because selflessness is not self-neglect, it is self-transcendence. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter. The difference between selfish and selfless is not the difference between caring about oneself and not caring about oneself. The difference is in how large the self becomes. Selfish collapses the self down to the most primitive boundaries. Selfless expands the self to include others. The selfish self is isolated. The selfless self is integrated. So what does this mean for us practically, spiritually, existentially? It means that the spiritual journey is not about rejecting the self. It's about refining it, maturing it, elevating it. It is recognizing that we are participants in a story larger than our own survival. It means understanding that our growth is not solidarity. We grow in relationship. We grow in community. We grow when we allow the boundaries of the self to stretch beyond our own comfort. In exercise science, this is the overload principle. To grow spiritually, we must be challenged to a level greater than that to which we are accustomed. This means that selfishness is not a moral failure, but a developmental stage. And selflessness is not moral superiority, but spiritual maturity. It means that the omega point, the direction toward which consciousness evolves, is not the erasure of individuality, but the harmony of individuals in greater unity. It means that daily we are faced with a choice: shrink into the small self or expand into the transcendent self. Live as if we are alone or live as if we belong. If we want to evolve spiritually, if we want to heal ourselves and our communities, if we want to address the deeper crises beneath our collective struggles, then we need to learn to reorder our loves, to step out from the center, to take our place not in front, not above, not below, but within the web of existence. Because when the self becomes rightly ordered, everything else begins to make sense. That is the spiritual work before me. That is the spiritual work before us. Thank you for sharing in this exploration with me. If it resonates with you, share it with a friend who might be interested in joining us on this path to spiritual evolution. Please like and follow so you don't miss an episode. Be good to yourself. Be good to others.